Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Deborah Baycroft.
And I'm Daniel Watkins.
And we are joined on this episode by a very special guest.
Back in August, we hosted historian, broadcaster and joint chief curator at Historic Royal Palaces, Tracy Borman, at Alnwick Castle. Tracy spoke about her latest book, Anne Boleyn Elizabeth I, the mother and daughter who changed history, to a fascinated audience in the castle guest hall. You can hear our thoughts on the book on episode 41 of the podcast.
Tracy Borman very kindly agreed to speak with us on the Alnwick Castle Podcast, and we had a great conversation about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, as well as the Tudors, other British monarchs, witches and witch trials and the witch hunts of England and Scotland. We also talked about Tracy's own career and more.
Please enjoy. We are very excited to welcome our special guest to this episode of the Alnwick Castle Podcast, Tracy Borman. Thank you so much for joining us, Tracy.
It's such a great pleasure to be with you. I feel that I'm kind of there at Alnwick because I can see your amazing backdrop, and I had such a fantastic time there in August. So, yeah, I'm feeling quite wistful down here.
Yeah, that's probably where we were going to start, actually. You were with us in August to talk about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I, and you hadn't been to Alnwick before, and we just thought we'd get on the record how you found the castle.
Oh, gosh. Suffice to say, it was worth the wait. It was absolutely wonderful. It was the most idyllic summer's day, and the castle just looks so stunning, against that bright blue sky. And I already knew I was in for a treat, but it, if possible, even exceeded my expectations. Just the imposing look of the place from the outside, and then these ornate rooms, the grand state rooms, sweeping gardens. It just breathes history, doesn't it? I had the most amazing time.
We were talking to you just before we went on mic about even the room that we're recording in has got a bit of a backstory to it going back centuries, so you can't really get away from it here.
I know. I love that. I think you should share that with your listeners if you haven't already.
So we're currently recording in a room in a tower that's now called the Beef Tower, but used to be called the Auditor's Tower. And the auditor in question was a man called William Worm, who had come to collect taxes originally for Cardinal Wolsey in the 1500s. He was suspected of fiddling the books, and the Earl of Northumberland got special royal permission to keep Worm a prisoner in this tower until, quote, he could make up the accounts to his lord's satisfaction. Oof. And we don't know if he ever got out.
Well, that's quite a warning for any other, would-be discrepancies or fraudsters or what. I had a meeting with my accountant earlier. Maybe I should have mentioned this. I'll do next time.
Yeah. That didn't end too well for the Earl of Northumberland of the time either, because he is the one who is connected with one of the subjects of your latest book. The 6th Earl of Northumberland and Anne Boleyn had a thing, or maybe not.
Absolutely. Didn't they? I think there was something going on between Anne and Henry Percy, for sure. But were they betrothed? I mean, that became the $1 million question, didn't it? But it was, a big part of why visiting Alnwick was so special is that you very kindly got out of your archives that incredible book, owned by Anne Boleyn and decorated with her dazzling white falcon. So that was a really nice connection. And then, of course, that history between Anne and a former earl makes it all the more intriguing. I love a bit of history where it happened, personally. But yes, did Anne already have sort of previous form, if you like, when she got together with Henry VIII? At first, I love the fact Henry always just changes history to suit himself. So at first, of course, there was no betrothal. But then when he wanted to get rid of Anne, yes, actually, he seemed to think there was a betrothal between her and Henry Percy. But I'm not sure. I think unless fresh evidence comes to light. But I do think there seems to have been some kind of strong connection between them.
Yeah, we like to tell the story just because it's a good story, even if it didn't quite happen
Yeah.
It brings somebody in that people have heard of. If they've not heard of the Percys, they know who Anne Boleyn was, so we can get
Yes.
that connection in without having to say it was necessarily true, but there's enough there to
Hey.
be something.
Absolutely. And if you've got an Anne Boleyn collection, you need to make the most of it. As someone who works at the Tower of London, I can tell you that. In that she's probably the number one reason that people visit the Tower, or the number one person that they ask about. Slightly, sometimes superseded by the princes in the Tower. But Anne Boleyn, she's just got the X factor, hasn't she?
Yeah. Especially when it came to the poor sixth Earl, who allegedly died of a broken heart the year after she was killed.
Yes, that's quite a romantic end to the story, isn't it? If there really was this kind of intimate relationship between them of whatever form it took, then yeah, there we go. It's all part of the tragedy, really, that is Anne Boleyn. But of course, there is a more positive end to Anne's story, and that's her daughter. So yeah, shameless plug for the book coming. So yeah, I mean, it was a joy to research mother and daughter, because they haven't been researched in detail before together, because very good reason. Elizabeth was only 2 years and 8 months old when Anne was executed, so I think people just assume Anne could have had no influence over her daughter, but piecing together the evidence, I found the exact opposite to that. Elizabeth spent her life trying to rehabilitate her mother, and of course she became the sweet revenge, if you like, of Anne Boleyn. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, yeah, Anne definitely had the last laugh when it came to Henry and their daughter, who he'd forgotten about, really. Never imagined that Elizabeth would come to the throne, especially after having his son Edward. But then there she was, the glory of the Tudor dynasty, and such a, can I say, chip off the old block? That's a terrible pun for the Tudor. In terms of being very similar to her mother, I think they shared so much in common. And yeah, as I say, it was a real joy kind of researching their story for this book.
Did it feel good to try and overturn this received idea of what relationship they had or didn't have,
Yes.
and kind of turn that around and go, actually, when you look at it,
Yeah,
they were closer than you would think?
it felt so good, actually, because I've had it quoted at me numerous times. Oh, Elizabeth only mentioned Anne Boleyn twice. That's kind of stated as fact. She didn't. It was quite a few more times than that. But you can see how people have got the wrong impression, because in her public speeches, Elizabeth talked much more about her father. She described herself as being the lion's cub and always talking about her father. But of course she would, because she was a political animal and she knew that nobody's going to question Henry VIII and her right to the throne through him. They are going to question her right to the throne through Anne Boleyn, the woman who was declared an adulteress and a traitor, and whose marriage to Henry was dissolved, was annulled, making Elizabeth illegitimate. So she had to tread carefully. So of course she's quite discreet when she mentions her mother, unlike her father, who she can't say enough about. But actually, I think it was him that she didn't really think that much of, and her mother, who, as I say, she felt an intense and abiding loyalty towards. So it was so satisfying to finally put the record straight on that. I've wanted to do it for a very, very long time, actually. The idea for the book first came to me about 15 years ago. And then it was always there on the back burner. And then we reordered the pictures at Hampton Court along the famous haunted gallery. We have a few ghosts as well. And at the end of the haunted gallery, you suddenly, in the new order of pictures, mother and daughter had been placed next to each other, or rather Anne above Elizabeth. And that was about 3 years ago. And I remember looking at those pictures and thinking, right, I need to get on with that book. Yeah.
What I found really interesting reading your book and during your talk was how much Elizabeth used her clothes
Yes.
and the decoration within those to show her mother and her mother's family, which I hadn't really ever thought about before, but that was such an interesting point.
Yeah.
She used her outward display subtly, but with enough that people would have known who she was talking about.
Exactly. It was one of my favourite things of the research, because looking at a Tudor portrait is kind of like code breaking. There's so much symbolism and meanings that many of which have probably been lost to us over the centuries. But then when you start to see Anne Boleyn's emblems creep into Elizabeth's clothes and how they're embroidered and decorated, that's a pretty clear message. And one of the symbols we see a lot, not just in Elizabeth's clothes, but in those of her courtiers, is Anne Boleyn's earliest known emblem, the armillary sphere, which is a sort of circular emblem showing the solar system, really. And it was said to symbolize constancy, which again was very appropriate for Elizabeth to display, because she was certainly a very constant friend and supporter of her mother. So, yeah, I loved those little details, just the detective work involved in studying in minute detail those portraits, not just of Elizabeth. I mentioned as well that her courtiers soon cottoned on to this. If they want to get ahead with Elizabeth, they need to display her mother's emblems and flatter Anne Boleyn. And it's also interesting that most of the surviving portraits of Anne date from Elizabeth's reign, not Anne's own lifetime.
One of the things I found interesting talking about the courtiers is how closely they were connected with the Boleyn side of Elizabeth's
Yes.
heritage. She was picking people who seemed to have a connection with her mother and who might have known her better than Elizabeth did, having been so young when she died.
That's absolutely right. And it's staggering when you look at the who's who of Elizabeth's court. The Boleyns absolutely dominate. And when I say the Boleyns, I mean Boleyns or Boleyn relatives, her maternal kin, if you like. So the Careys, Sackvilles, Radcliffes, Howards, they're all related to Anne Boleyn. And they absolutely rule the roost. Elizabeth gives all the best positions to her female relations, the likes of Henry Carey, her cousin. He was the son of Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, and then Catherine Carey in Elizabeth's privy chamber, which of course was staffed only by women. That was Mary Boleyn's daughter, and intriguingly could have been Henry VIII's daughter, I think, because he had an affair, of course, with Mary Boleyn, and Catherine's date of birth does coincide, should we say, with that. So it might be that Elizabeth had her half sister serving her, not just her cousins. But yeah, it became, I think one historian rightly described it as a closed shop, Elizabeth's court, because you had to have a very, very strong tie to Elizabeth's mother, really, to stand a chance of securing a position there.
The Percys did not do so well in that regard in Elizabeth's time.
Afraid not. The Percys, that there were certain families that Elizabeth chose to studiously ignore. And yeah, her father's relatives didn't come off too well. She saw them as a threat, I think. But yeah, the Percys as well.
Yeah.
Sorry
No,
about that.
and that's all right. It's just a few heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, between friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we're quite used to having less happy endings with most of the Percys.
Yeah.
Not just within sort of Elizabethan or Tudor periods, but much further back as well.
Yeah, it's that we share that in common with the Tower as well. I talk a lot about the Tower, and I always have to do a health warning. Look, there aren't many happy endings. I'm afraid. It's the Tower. What could possibly go wrong?
I was last at the Tower probably this time last year in October, and did go to find the tower in the corner where the ninth Earl of Northumberland, who was alive at the end of Elizabeth's reign, where he ended up a couple of years after she died in, I think it's the Martin Tower in the corner.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, it's an exhibition in there at the moment, but I did go in and just have a little look around to see what his space might have been when he spent 15 years in there at the start of the Stuart period.
Well, there you go. Yes, a bit of a long-serving prisoner, actually. But isn't it amazing when you're just in the space, even if, as you say, there's something else in it now and it's changed? For me, just being in the space that somebody you've been researching or you're familiar with used to be, that's really, really special. By the way, the Martin Tower also has some graffiti that I was shown recently that I didn't know was there, but it's George Boleyn's autograph, almost certainly. So Anne's brother, when he was kept prisoner, we think he was in the Martin Tower because if it doesn't say Boleyn, I'm not sure what it does say. And it wouldn't have been, Anne wouldn't have signed herself Boleyn. Obviously, she was queen, and her apartments, we know where she was kept, and they're long since destroyed. So we think it was George Boleyn who left his mark on the walls of the Marketing Tower. I love a bit of graffiti personally. I just think it's like staring history in the face, isn't it? And these people, you realise they really existed, and and they've left their mark forever.
And it just sort of shows that people don't change. When you think about graffiti now, it's always been how people have left their mark on somewhere, isn't it?
Exactly. George was here, and but there is that need to leave something behind, especially with prisoners who know they're not going to be around for much longer, but they just need to have left something, I think, for posterity.
Because George really wasn't around much longer by the time he was in the Tower.
No, absolutely not. No, matter of days. And then he was executed just shortly before Anne. And, I really feel for Thomas Boleyn, the father, because he's often portrayed as just this scheming courtier who kind of sacrifices his children for advancement. But I'm not so sure he was. I think actually the evidence suggests he was quite keen to keep Anne away from Henry. He'd already sort of sacrificed one daughter to the king. So, but yeah, he basically lost everything, but kept his life, I guess. But there, as I say, my original point is that Anne Boleyn's story does have a happy ending in Elizabeth, and that's what we can celebrate. I would always argue the greatest monarch we've ever had. Though I do come up against some opponents with that argument, but I think she was pretty impressive.
Yeah, there was another book you wrote a couple of years ago, Crown and Scepter, that goes into all of the kings and queens, and I like that book very much. When it came out, it was just getting every chapter with a different monarch. And Elizabeth's your favourite, but were there any when you were writing that one where you thought, oh, actually, this king or queen is much more interesting than has previously been portrayed?
Yes. I would say the early Henrys actually were the first ones to stand out because, my Henrys really start with Henry VII, and then, the ones before, maybe a bit of Henry VI. But the early, so, Henry I, the sort of great administrator, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, and he really kind of was the father of modern government, also has the dubious claim of fathering more illegitimate children than any other monarch. I think it's 25 or 26. I need to check back, but it was an impressive number anyway. And yeah, Henry II and his consort Eleanor of Aquitaine and their empire, really fascinating stuff. And Henry III, who really shaped the Tower of London. Like, we think that William the Conqueror built the Tower of London, but he built the White Tower, which is the most famous bit of it. But the tower as we know it today was really formed by Henry III. So I enjoyed that. I mean, perhaps there's a reason they're not the most famous. You might not call it.
I don't know. Henry III had a polar bear, did he not?
He did have a polar bear.
That's a great story.
I love the Tower Menagerie stories about how, it starts off with King John being given a gift, a compensation prize for, he loses Normandy and he's given some wild beasts in compensation. So what the hell do you do with some wild beasts? Well, you put them in the tower where they can't escape. Basically, that's why they chose the tower. It's totally unsuitable as a zoo, effectively. But suddenly there are elephants rubbing shoulders with lions and prisoners, and then a polar bear. You're quite right, the polar bear. Now, we talk a lot about worst jobs in history, and usually it's things like a gong scourer or similar kind of toilet-related jobs. But I think the worst has to be the man who was appointed keeper of the polar bear at the tower, because he was given the task of going swimming with it in the Thames when it was, swimming and fishing for the fat salmon that used to swim in the Thames. This poor guy had to go swimming with a polar bear, but he survived somehow. But yeah, I wouldn't have wanted that job.
I think Anne Boleyn is a deserving most asked about person at the Tower, but I think the polar bear swimming man should be second place.
I think he should be second place. I think, yeah. Thank you for raising that, Daniel, because I think, yeah, he's an unsung hero.
When you're studying and researching and writing your books, whether they're about Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth and specific people or more generally, do you come across these unsung heroes in the documents and in the items? And do you find it important to try and draw a bit of light onto them as well?
Yes, I do, absolutely. And it's lovely to give them a bit of prominence, particularly. So I like writing about the kind of behind closed doors aspects of court life, so private life, if you will, and so just bringing out of the shadows servants, people who cooked for kings and queens, or who cleaned, or who kept them company, and those names have just sort of been buried in records for the most part for hundreds of years. So I love being able to weave them into my narratives, whether that's fiction or non-fiction. Actually, yeah, it's very rewarding.
Yeah, speaking of fiction, I'm actually in the middle of The King's Witch.
Oh,
because I bought it at the book talk the other month.
oh, thank you, Deborah.
It's very good. I'm really enjoying it. What was it about that subject that you decided to write a novel about as opposed to more non-fiction?
Well, I mean, I know we have in common, the three of us, an interest in witchcraft. I think that sounds dodgy, but an interest in witchcraft, actually. And I wrote a non-fiction book about the English witch hunts, and in particular how James VI and First really dominated and shaped that period of our history.
Mm-hmm.
He was the ultimate witch hunting monarch, wrote a whole book about it. And so researching it for the non-fiction book, it was such an eye-opener for me, and very dark and disturbing time of our history. And a lot of the evidence that I was coming across was really disturbing. And I almost felt it wasn't enough just to write a non-fiction account of this. I wanted to dramatize it. I wanted to get across the full horror of living in those times, of how easy it was to end up accused of witchcraft if you were, well, mostly female, poor, perhaps sort of on the periphery of society, not liked by your community. It was a very, very handy way of getting rid of somebody. And of course, no evidence was required. It was just an accusation, because what evidence could you really put forward for a spell or, somebody having been cursed? And so it was terrifyingly easy to go from being suspected to accused to condemned. And I really wanted to get across that sense of jeopardy and horror, if you like. So that was the inspiration. And then I sort of wove in the gunpowder plot into all of that, because it was a real melting pot of a time, the early years of our first Stuart king. He had a lot of opponents. He was always fearful of assassins, and actually quite rightly so. As I say, he wasn't popular. And so there were the witch hunts, there's the gunpowder plot, there's his attempts to unite England and Scotland, not very successfully. And I thought, gosh, we have overlooked this period, actually. And I'm guilty of that as well. I tend to write mostly about the Tudors. But the Stuart period, especially the early Stuart period, is absolutely fascinating. Quite dark history, I'd say.
Quite often when we're talking about these periods, you think of the Tudor period ended when Elizabeth died. The Stuart period started when James VI and First took the English throne. But there must have been overlap. There were people who will have been in the royal courts of both people who would have known Elizabeth who carried on.
Yes.
So dealing with that overlap, there's generations of people who kind of carry on in the same way that Anne Boleyn's people knew Elizabeth.
Yes.
So do you find the same people coming up again and again and the same families turning up?
Yes, that's a really good point, because while, of course, James brings some new blood with him to England, there is that crossover. There are people who have served both monarchs and who can compare, who you see it initially trying to fit in and celebrate the fact, there's a king, hooray, and we've had 50 years of queens, and now we've got, things as it should be with a king, things as they should be. But then you see the gradual sort of disdain creep in from those who had known Elizabeth. And now they're encountering a very different kettle of fish in James, who doesn't really buy into that pomp and pageantry and ceremony of the Tudor court and the etiquette. His court is a bit of a free-for-all, and there's sort of drunken parties and the plays and the masks that he likes, they tend to descend into chaos, and half the actors are vomiting over the stage because they've had too much to drink. And so the courtiers who had been used to Elizabeth, they're absolutely horrified. And you see that disrespect, I think, a new sense of disrespect for the monarchy start to creep in. Of course, that then accelerates in the reign of James's son and successor, Charles I, with disastrous results for the monarchy.
And even more witch hunting.
Yes, exactly. So James himself absolutely gives new energy to the witch hunts in England that really had died off or were dying off. Elizabeth didn't show a great deal of interest in them, but now they came back with vigor. And you get the likes of Shakespeare writing Macbeth, the witch play, really to flatter the new king. But interestingly, by the time of James's death, he had actually cooled off from the idea of witchcraft. I love the fact that on his deathbed, he called for the services of a wise woman, the very sort of women that he'd been persecuting. But he was desperate, obviously. He knew he was dying. So it's like, bring me a witch to cure me after all that. But then there was a resurgence again. Witchcraft never totally goes away. There was a resurgence during the Civil War with, Matthew Hopkins and the Witchfinder General. You suddenly get it flaring up again. And you might say we still have witch hunts today. Certainly there are practicing witches today, white witches. And I certainly got some interesting correspondence when I wrote my books on witchcraft. It was an eye-opener, but all very interesting to read about people's experiences.
What I found interesting with the novel is I've just got past where Frances is first put into the tower, and she has her they're searching for evidence, and the horror that she has just within that short period of time, it really brings it how much these poor women were suffering just to prove a point, because in this novel it's more Cecil's trying to find somebody just to appease the king.
Exactly. It's almost like offering a sacrificial lamb to James. And in this instance, so I used Frances, my heroine, who was a real person, I should say. She was the daughter of one of Elizabeth I's favourite ladies, but we know hardly anything about her. So the whole tale of witchcraft was one I embroidered. But yeah, we know a lot about how suspected witches were treated and tortured, really. Torture was illegal in England, but that didn't mean to say it didn't happen. And things like that James sanctioned was searching for the devil's mark. It was believed, when a woman became a witch, she would make a pact with the devil and he'd leave his mark on her. And this mark looked like a kind of natural blemish, like a mole or something like that. But when pricked with a blade or similar, it wouldn't bleed or it wouldn't cause any pain. And so witch prickers were sort of suddenly that was a genuine profession, and they would basically go around pretty much stabbing a suspected witch, or at least jabbing them with the edge of their blade until they stopped crying out, and then they would say, "Aha, we found the witch's mark." Well, most times the poor woman had fainted away from the pain. And so that was a disturbing scene, I have to say, to write, because I knew it was based on fact very definitely. And even though a proportion of women who were arrested for witchcraft were subsequently released, not many of them, their lives were pretty much ruined by that whole terrifying, harrowing experience, I think.
These women who might have been lost to history are being brought to attention, whether it's through your fiction books or non-fiction books, in the same way that very famous women like Anne Boleyn Elizabeth I are getting new attention.
Yes.
Is there still lots more to discover, or is it harder to get through the records and find the evidence in the first place?
It can be quite hard because we know that the vast majority of records relating to witchcraft cases were lost, either destroyed in fires or deliberately destroyed. We have what I suspect is the tip of the iceberg, and actually probably there were many, many more cases that we know about. And so, I was very keen to bring as many names into my narrative, both the fiction and the non-fiction, as possible. But the sad fact is there'll be an awful lot more who will be forever lost to history. You tend to hear about the high profile cases. So I researched in depth the case of the Belvoir Castle witches in Leicestershire, and they came to prominence because they were said to have bewitched the Earl of Rutland's sons to death. So it was a very famous case, actually probably more famous than Pendle, but we all now know Pendle. But then the lesser known case is just the everyday woman in the community who isn't very well liked. Her neighbours think this is a great way of getting rid of her. They're just lost. They're lost to us, which is a tragedy. But hopefully by shining a light on some of those cases, we can get a sense that there's a much greater story to tell here.
Are there still more stories to tell about the Tudors? You've said it's one of your favourite subjects. There's been, not just by you, but so many books written. There is so much interest, so many films and TV shows and documentaries. But is there still more to find out?
Well, I of course, I'm going to say yes. Not least because my next two books are about the Tudors. So there are two things. There's either the Holy Grail, that is a new discovery, whether that's a new document, a new artifact, and they do come up. At Hampton Court, we've just put on display a ring that almost certainly belonged to Anne Boleyn's father or brother, and it was found by a metal detectorist, which is remarkable that these things still come to light. Or I think perhaps more likely is an archive, a document, because quite a small fraction of the documents in the National Archives, for example, have really been looked at in detail. We're talking about miles and miles of documents in the National Archives, and who knows what else is out there. But of course, there is also the second thing is that there's a new way of looking at a familiar subject, and I guess that's what I found with Anne and Elizabeth, in that we know Anne's story well, we know Elizabeth's story well, but we don't know the two combined. And that's what excites me, when there's a different way of looking at something, if you're not able to find that holy grail of a brand new discovery. Although, if ever you let me come rummaging in the attics of Alnwick, yeah, I'm sure you get asked this a lot. It's like, we get asked at Hampton Court and the Tower, have you looked for Anne Boleyn's bee pendant anywhere? It's like, yeah, we're pretty sure we've checked our attics. It's not up there, but who knows what may come to light.
Is there a holy grail particularly that you would like to find?
Well, the thing is, I've just stolen my own punchline there, because actually it has to be Anne Boleyn's bee necklace. I mean, it's so iconic. Or Anne's letters to Henry, because frustratingly, we only have his side of the correspondence. We have his love letters. 17 of them survive in the Vatican archives in Rome. Fascinatingly, I think probably they were stolen by a supporter of Catherine of Aragon, because they made their way over there when Henry was still trying to persuade the Pope to have his marriage annulled. But we don't have Anne's replies. Now, I'm almost certain they were destroyed because of her fate. Yeah, Henry wouldn't want any evidence from her side of how she felt about him when he was trying to get her condemned as an adulteress. But it's so tantalizing. You sometimes can tell what she said to Henry, because he refers to it and he's full of woe because he's not getting what he wants, and clearly she's playing him brilliantly. But I would have loved to have read her letters. So yeah, I think we need to start checking the behind the panelling at Belvoir Castle and places like that to find out.
So, have you had a good rummage in Hampton Court and the Tower of London? What's it like actually getting to explore those places on a daily basis?
Oh, it is amazing. And you will both know this very well, in that the sense of huge privilege when you get to go through the doors that say private on them, or lift that rope barrier and just go exploring. It's an absolute joy. Now, we do open the best bits of the palace to the public, or all our palaces. So it's not that we're hiding all these great things. But for me, where I really like to go rummaging is at Hampton Court. We have the archaeological stores. So interesting bits of archaeology we've discovered at all 6 palaces. A lot of that ends up at Hampton Court. And there are, there's everything from the sort of leather mache decorations from Jane Seymour's time, so wife number 3, that used to be on the ceiling of the Great Watching Chamber, through to my favourite, fragments of Elizabeth I's bathroom at Whitehall Palace. So a completely lost palace. There's this beautiful green glazed tiles, very decorated. She actually inherited the bathroom from her father, Henry VIII, but she loved to bathe in style. So most people, it was a wooden tub lined with linen so you didn't get splinters. Elizabeth went to town when she bathed. So she had all of these beautiful glazed tiles. Steam was pumped in. It was kind of like a Turkish bath. She had oyster shells from which water poured. And she even had an organ installed in the room next door so that she could be kind of serenaded when she took a bath. So, she does things in style, does Elizabeth. And I love the clues that you find, a little bit of, broken tile, and then the story of Elizabeth's bathroom starts to emerge. So that's, I love a good rummage. I should say as well, the dress collection is at Hampton Court. So the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection, to give it its full name. And that's where there are treasures such as we call it, the lost dress of Elizabeth I, which was paraded as an altar cloth for many years, but then our dress curators have identified it as actually being probably the dress that Elizabeth wears in the famous rainbow portrait. And then there's also, all the way up to really modern royals. We've got items of dress. We've got Edward VIII's baby shoes. We've got the pram used to push Princess Margaret around in. Just these very, very personal traces of former and current royals. And for me, it's the personal that really gets me. So it's when you see handwritten notes in the pockets of a suit that once belonged to a king, and just absolute shivers down the spine moment when you realize they're human beings as well. They might be royal, but they are human beings too.
And is that why you enjoy writing books? So you can really focus onto these very personal pieces of history that you don't really get when it's sort of in
Yes.
big towers or palaces or on TV or anything like that?
Exactly. It's the personal that I find the most fascinating and the most fulfilling, being able to bring these people to life, to really get behind the public image, because often I write about kings or queens or prominent figures. So we know their public image, but what were they like as human beings? And, that's all thanks to my A-level history teacher, Mrs. Jones, who she's the one who made me really fall in love with the Tudors. And she said, they're human beings. Don't look at them as kings and queens. You have to understand that human nature, as we were saying earlier, doesn't actually change that much over the centuries. So you have to look at their motivations in that context, not just in the sort of, the great decisions that they made when running the state. You have to look at what they're also experiencing in their private lives, their health wise, and then sort of build a picture of who this person was. That's what I get the most satisfaction out of, when I think I kind of have got what makes someone tick. But then at the end of the day, who knows? I could be completely wrong, but we can only be guided by the sources.
One of the books that was really popular here at the castle when you came in August was The Private Lives of the Tudors, where you were able to look into that. But the new book does that for Anne and Elizabeth as well. And I think the impression we both got is Elizabeth is a woman who has more power than almost anyone's ever had, but she's still just a woman who never knew her mum.
Yes, I'm so pleased you said that. That's exactly it. There's that personal dimension. She never really knew her mother. She could have had precious few, if any, memories of Anne Boleyn. And yet clearly Anne was of crucial importance to Elizabeth. She was part of her identity. And I think Elizabeth really felt keenly this sense of injustice that Anne had been served. Anne, when she was on the scaffold, she made this very complimentary speech in which she praised Henry VIII when you might have expected her to damn him. But she did say, "If any person shall meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." In other words, if anyone looks into what happened to me in future, I hope they'll make up their own mind as to whether I was guilty. And Elizabeth took that to heart, I think, and she really did miss no opportunity to show her loyalty towards her mother. And there's a great tragedy there, even as late as 1578. Elizabeth has been queen for 20 years. Anne Boleyn, has been dead for more than 40 years. But when Elizabeth attends a service of Thanksgiving in Norwich Cathedral, that's Boleyn heartland, really, where the Boleyn family chapel is, her eyes don't leave that chapel. And by the end of the service, they're filled with tears. So it's that personal story. I think that's what always makes me come back for more.
That goes all the way back to Anne as well. She's thinking about her daughter while she's queen, while all this is going on, even before Elizabeth's born at her coronation.
Yes, she is.
She's thinking of her daughter.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost the very last thing Anne does on earth is to order clothes for Elizabeth. When you see that was really a moment for me in the National Archives, looking through Anne's account books. And it is the last thing she spends money on, is ordering beautiful made-to-measure clothes for her not yet 3-year-old daughter. And she's also, in her final days, begging her chaplain Matthew Parker to look after Elizabeth. And I think that's why she gives that unusually complimentary speech about Henry VIII, when you would think this feisty woman is going to let rip now on the scaffold. But she's very, very nice about Henry. And I think that's because she has Elizabeth in mind. She wants him to treat her kindly when she's gone. So it's absolutely obvious that Elizabeth is at the forefront of Anne's mind throughout Elizabeth's life with Anne, that brief time they're together. But then, as Anne faces her own death.
Do you think as well Anne's final words at the scaffold might have been for Elizabeth as well?
Yes.
Not just for everybody else to sort of say, don't
Absolutely.
judge me, I wasn't guilty, kind of.
Yes, I do completely think that Anne would have known that every word she said would be written down, that she's a fallen queen. Of course, everyone's going to be writing about it. And she knows that Elizabeth will see that. So I think every word is very carefully judged with her daughter in mind. And I love the fact that Elizabeth does make her own mind up, because she was probably surrounded by people growing up who bought into this propaganda of Henry's, that Anne was the great whore and the concubine, and she'd plotted his death, and she was an adulteress. Elizabeth would have heard all of that, but she made her own mind up, and she realized just how wronged her mother had been, and she favors anybody who says the same. So not just Boleyn relatives, but early in her reign, there are lots of Protestant writers, and they're calling Anne really the root of the Reformation, because Anne was a great reformer, and they're really showering praise on Anne's memory, and Elizabeth really favours writers such as that.
500 years later, when people are visiting the palaces now, you mentioned how often Anne Boleyn is a reason for coming. Are the majority of people with you in that she has been misunderstood? Is there a variety of opinions, or have people generally turned from how they would have thought of her in 1536?
Yes, I think there has been the biggest rehabilitation perhaps of any character in history, although of course I don't want to talk about Richard III, but he has his legions of fans as well. But very much, I think the reason Anne is the most talked about of the six wives is because people are absolutely behind her. They realize how wronged she was. She's very relatable because she's a very outspoken, sort of fiery woman. She's not prepared to conform to being a second-class citizen like every other woman, and dominated by the men in her life. She has ideas, and she has vision for England, and she wants to implement that. But of course, ultimately, she's not judged by her mind. She's judged by her body. And that's, let's be honest, the only reason Henry gets rid of Anne Boleyn. If she'd given him a son, she would have been forever protected. But that didn't happen. So I think Anne is absolutely celebrated as a heroine today. And I think that really has its roots in the reign of her daughter. I'm not sure how we would see Anne today if Elizabeth hadn't led the field in that respect and really, really celebrated her mother, increasingly so as her reign went on. And then it's just reverberated down the centuries, really.
One of the more interesting things, again, of your book is you focused on how much Anne was a reformer before she ever met Henry. And that, again, was something I'd never really thought about. But she's been at the French court, all of these French learned women. She's read about it. She's already made her mind up before anything ever happens with the king.
Exactly. And isn't that passed over? I think we're so obsessed with Anne's downfall and the kind of the drama of her and Henry that you lose the person that Anne was. And she was an absolutely passionate reformer. So she took great risks for her faith. She had books that would be deemed heresy imported secretly into England so that she could read them with her friends and fellow reformers. And she even dared to show one of them to Henry VIII, The Obedience of the Christian Man, which really inspired Henry with the idea that he was above the Pope and that he was only answerable to God. So she took a risk in doing that, but it paid off. But she was an absolute visionary when it came to not just religion, but social reform. She had ideas for poor relief, and she wanted the proceeds from the dissolution of the monasteries to go to charitable causes, not to the king. And that's what set her on a collision course with Thomas Cromwell, who was absolutely trying to make Henry a rich man through the dissolution. But we lose all of that. I think what I really loved doing in Anne and Elizabeth was just getting to that other part of Anne, who she actually was, what made her tick, what her ideas were, quite apart from the whole Henry side to her story.
Yeah. She'd have made a very good Countess of Northumberland.
She would. She would. If only she'd gone with poor old Henry Percy.
Just to ask a hypothetical question, because we know that historians love hypotheticals. You're able to do a podcast with either Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I.
Oh.
Who do you pick? Who would you want to find out more from?
Oh gosh, that is so hard.
Sorry.
I can't choose them both. Purely because she's where my love of history began and is my all-time historical heroine. I'd have to say Elizabeth. I think there's so much I want to know from Elizabeth. I want to know first and foremost, did I get it right about how she felt towards her mother? That would be my first question. Just what it was like being a queen regnant in this male-dominated age. And probably if I dared to ask her this question, I'd say, so were you really the Virgin Queen then? I get asked that all the time. And I always defend her virtue and say she absolutely was the Virgin Queen, in my opinion. But yeah, I'd like to get it from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
If people would like to know where they could see you next, where would you suggest they go?
Well, I'm currently on my book tour, so I'm doing lots of talks across the country. Annex was one of the first, and I'm also going to be on screen because we've just finished filming a new series of Inside the Tower of London. I think it's series 6 now. You'd think we'd have run out of stories, but we haven't, and there's still lots of great stuff to come, including some Tudor favourites in there. Now, I'm not quite sure of the transmission date for that, but it's likely to be kind of November time. And yeah, I'm biased, but it is a good one. Any fans of the Tower, because the great thing about that series, I think, I tell the history, but it's also a living history as well. There's lots of kind of day-to-day life at the Tower and following the Beefeaters round, following the Ravens round. They're always very popular. So yeah, that should be out soon.
Do you know the Ravens well?
Not well enough. I can identify a couple of them, But those people who are based at the Tower, I'm more based at Hampton Court, they will immediately say, oh, yeah, that's Poppy, or that's Jubilee. Or I know Poppy because she's the naughtiest and she is always up to no good. And it was Poppy who I nearly came a cropper with, because I was actually filming. This was not this summer before. And I was standing on the ramparts. Now, I should say the ravens are very territorial. They each have their favourite bit of the tower that they kind of patrol. So if you hear squawking, it's often that another raven has come on their patch. But I was on Poppy's patch. I was on the ramparts, kind of overlooking the White Tower. And I was wearing a red jacket. Now, those two things combined made Poppy furious. She literally sees red. If anybody's wearing red, she goes for them. And I was standing there talking to camera, and I was aware of this black shape kind of sidling up along the railing next to me. And the next thing I knew, she was going for it. She was pecking my jacket. And let's just say, yeah, the jacket is worse for wear, because that beak, it could snap off your finger just like that. So, and she took exception to me being there. So suffice to say, we got out of there pretty quickly, while I still had, remnants of a jacket left. So yeah, thanks, Poppy.
Our most recent episode of this podcast had a section about the 8th Earl of Northumberland, who died in mysterious circumstances in the Tower of London during Elizabeth I's reign. And I think when we were researching this, we both got distracted by stories of the ravens in the tower and wondering what they were up to at the time and whether they would have known anything.
Yeah, they're so popular that, they've got their own social media accounts, and they've got recently a book written about them. And I think, that people are fascinated by them. But yeah, it's always interesting when I'm working at the Tower and you see people who aren't used to being at the Tower, and they unwittingly leave an exposed sandwich within view of a raven, and that sandwich doesn't usually last very long. So yeah, beware. Keep your Tupperware closed when you come to the Tower.
And is there anything you can hint at for what's coming next on the book front?
Oh, I can tell you that the book I'm working on at the moment is fiction. It's Tudor fiction, my first Tudor fiction. And let's just say it's a very well-known character, and one who just might have been mentioned in the course of our chat today.
Well, hopefully you'll return to Alnwick Castle for us when that's out to talk about it. But for now, Tracy Borman, thank you very much for joining us on the Alnwick Castle podcast.
Thank you so much. And yes, please, to coming back to Alnwick.
That was us speaking with Tracy Borman. We hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as we did recording it.
If you did like the episode, we'd appreciate any positive ratings or reviews you can leave on your podcast platform. And if there are any Alnwick Castle questions you'd like us to answer on the podcast, please send them to podcast@alnwickcastle.com and we'll use them in our upcoming 50th episode.
We'll be back in 2 weeks when we go back to the medieval world for a look at the scriptorium. Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.